What I've got so far is first I wrote a wiggle example and then I started working on abstracting that. And as I was abstracting it, I was kind of looking for two different layers where one of the layers would be the Win32 OpenGL layer and one layer would be the Win32 general graphics layer that has nothing to do with specific graphics APIs, but just does general graphics things like creating windows. And I was going to try to figure out how to put an abstraction layer on top of each of those concrete things to hide the Win32 part. So I would have an abstract OS graphics general layer and an abstract OS OpenGL layer. But the issue is it's a little hard to decide exactly where I want to put things without some more concrete examples. I was recently watching a video by Brian Will. He did a series of videos on object-oriented programming with an interesting follow-up more recently. And in that follow-up video, he uses a term that I don't think I've heard anywhere else before that I rather liked, which is speculative generalization. I'm not actually going to use that exact term. I think it's a little more appropriate to say speculative abstraction in this place, not speculative generalization, but now doesn't seem like a good time to get into that distinction in detail. So anyways, while I'm going to go do this abstraction, I'd like to avoid doing it speculatively. Having concrete things and abstracting the concrete things works way better than first coming up with a speculative abstraction. And having one concrete example and abstracting it is nice, but having two concrete examples that both need to implement the same API is even better. It's more constraints, it's more real information telling us what we really need to do. We could easily make up an API that would work for the OpenGL one that wouldn't work for the D3D one without knowing. So what I want to do is before I move on, I'm going to hit pause on the OpenGL progress and go and do D3D. Really quickly, before I get onto the D3D part, I would like to clean up the Win32 OpenGL example that I've been working on, because in the last video I left it in a sort of in-between state. It was partially set up as an example, but partially set up to help with the transition into an abstract version. Now that I have a separate abstract copy of the same code, I can revert the example back to the nice flat thing where it's just one simple file, so I can turn my XList headers into XList macros, and my separate definitions files can just be copy pasted straight into the example code, and so my example simplifies back down to just one clean flat file. So I don't know the D3D11 API basically at all, which means I have a little bit of a problem. I want to start off with a concrete example that shows the basics of what I want to abstract, but I don't even know how to write that concrete example. So unlike the Win32 OpenGL case where I was sort of just going through the motions of writing something in a concrete form, this is more of an exploratory learning phase. Once I get how to put a D3D11 example together, I will then be able to clean it up into an example that fits my style correctly, and then go on to the abstraction part. But we need to start with the learning phase. So when I'm learning a new API, my preferred method is to start with an example program. Learning a new API is maybe something like learning a new language. You don't really want to start off by just reading the dictionary. You kind of want to start off by hearing examples of the language and practicing speaking it, seeing how ideas fit together in that language. And same thing with APIs. I don't really want to start by reading all the docs and kind of hopefully getting a picture of where to start and how you set the program up and which thing to do first and how to derive one thing from the next. I wanted to start from a simple working example that shows the structure of the API. I can then use the docs as a dictionary to go fill in advanced features, which is like using a dictionary to learn advanced vocab of a language where you already know the basics, right? So I think that that's sort of my preferred method here. I'm going to go look for someone else's example. Now, I'm not going to find an example that exactly meets my preferred style, but I'm going to look for one that's fairly close. In particular, I don't need it to show a lot of advanced features. I would prefer it to be as small as possible because the smaller it is, the more likely I will be able to convert the whole thing. I don't need it to be like a library already. I'm going to do the APIs myself. I need it to just be easy to build, just as plain and flat as possible. Now, I'm not necessarily going to find something exactly like that, but I'm looking for something along those lines. I'm sort of trying to optimize for those characteristics. So I just searched for a D3D11 example on GitHub, and I looked through a few of them, and this one in particular that came up was almost exactly what I was looking for. So big thanks to the user IonDune who posted this fairly concise example. I'm now going to take it and run with this. Here I suspect it might be useful if I explain how I go about converting a piece of code that's not in the style I want into my style. Unfortunately, I don't really know what would be useful to say about that process, so I'm going to try my best and say a few of the things that I did in this particular case, but I don't know what it would actually be helpful, so why don't you leave in the comments if you have any ideas of ways I should go over this or questions you have about how I go about converting code that is not quite the way I want it to the way I want it without losing functionality. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is it's in a pretty C++y style. It's very small, lightweight code, but there are a few things that it's using from the C++ library and language that I want to get off of. So it's using lambdas and the standard library function stuff from more modern C++. I definitely want to get off of that. So I try and go in and convert those to function pointers and then pretty soon realize that those can actually just be statically linked functions because they're only there abstracted like that because of the imagination that we will want some kind of layer where we plug in like an update and cleanup function, but really I can just hard code that stuff. There's no need to abstract it. We're going for an example here, not a library, right? Secondly, there are some variables that were getting captured by the lambdas using closures. And since I'm getting rid of the lambdas entirely, I just moved those to global variables. I think that's a pretty appropriate thing to do for an example because you're keeping the scope so small that you know that those globals won't get used in inappropriate places because your example shouldn't be so big that you couldn't just sit down and read it and double check that they're not getting used in inappropriate places. So that's how I'm going to go about simplifying that part. So those are the things I'm going about changing. Besides that, I'm just massaging the details that don't compile correctly. And as I'm going, I'm also keeping a list here because remember, this is my first pass. I'm encountering things for the first time. So as I'm encountering names of things and I don't know what they do, I am writing that list down and saying, here's something I need to research. There's something I need to research. Later on, I'm going to go read the docs, and having that list ready will make it a lot easier to zero in on the things that I kind of already have to understand but need more details about, and then I will be able to learn faster from the docs. Next up, I go and read the docs. This is, again, a part where there's not a lot for me to comment on. I just sit and read most of it, at least all the stuff that I think catches my eye that is going to be relevant to stuff I'm interested in doing. I start by following through the list of notes I took earlier and going and reading those things, and I do a little bit of fiddling with the code to make sure my understanding is correct as I'm going. So I'm using what I learned from going through the first example to sort of bootstrap myself into the docs and understanding how they're laid out and how the pieces are connected. And from there I can sort of spider out and explore more topics and get a pretty good idea of alternatives that I could use in certain parts of the example, places where I could invoke more advanced features to get effects in the future, things like that. But most of this is just about sitting and reading one line at a time, everything that's there. Luckily, this API is not that overly complex. It is kind of funny in the sense that it's object-oriented, so navigating the docs is all organized around the objects, which can be a little tedious and frustrating. But there's not a lot I can do to make that easier. You just got to keep clicking around until you figure out where they put the thing you're looking for. Once you find your way to the root of the system and you kind of start going through it, you'll figure out what you want to read, hopefully, and read as much of it as you can. I spent about an hour and a half reading a bunch of this stuff, and I came away feeling like I had a pretty good understanding of how I would use this API moving forward. So that's it for today. See you in the next video.